What's up everyone, I'm Jacob, also known as Jonesy, and last week I put up a poll on my YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram asking which of 4 Nostalgix decks I should feature in a deck tech video next, and the winner was Turbo Extra Life. But before we look at the list, if you have not subscribed yet, please hit the subscribe button and hit the bell to be notified every time I put out a new video. So the first deck I ever built in Nostalgix was completely centered around the card Extra Life. It is a 6-mana spell, which lets you return any fighter from any player's void to your side of the field, and if it's a first level fighter, it gains charge so it can attack right away. As soon as I saw Extra Life, I immediately wanted to build a deck around it, and it turned out the Extra Life was so good it ended up being restricted in the first few con tournaments. However, with the release of Harmonic Surge, the webcam tournaments and the Nostalgix Discord have not had a restricted list yet. Right now, it is unclear whether or not Extra Life is going to be restricted or not, so I'm going to go over this list, which has 4 copies of Extra Life, and afterwards I'll explain a couple tweaks you can make to the deck in case it does get restricted back down to 2. Also, I need to clarify, I have not actually played a game with this specific list before, because there is no webcam tournament in the Nostalgix Discord this week. So while this deck may not be perfectly tuned, it should be a great starting point for anyone wanting to play Extra Life themselves. So looking at the list, first off, the hero on the deck is Lucky Frog Merchant. Once per turn, she lets you pay 1 mana to draw 1 card and void 2 cards from the top of your deck. Lucky Frog Merchant is an amazing engine in this deck because we're going to be wanting all of our big fighters to get into our void, and the fact that it draws a card gives us tremendous card advantage because it does not actually cost a card in hand every time we use her ability. So there are going to be some times where we will end the turn with more than 10 cards in hand and have to discard something that way. It won't happen often. A lot of the times you'll hover around 8 or 9 cards in hand, but there will be times where if you don't find a way to discard one of your fighters that you need to discard in your hand, you can just use Lucky Frog Merchant to eventually discard to hand size. Now, as for the fighters we're going to bring back with Extra Life, the main fighter is Gelephants. It is a 9-mana fighter with 13 health. When it comes into play, it deals 3 damage to all other fighters and all heroes. It has a 10 damage attack, and it has another attack, Berserker Rage, which just deals 3 damage to everything, including itself. Gelephant is by far the best fighter to bring back with Extra Life. Because it is a first level fighter, it will come back with charge thanks to Extra Life, which means you can deal 6 to all of your opponent's fighters and your opponent's hero. You'll also deal 6 to all of your fighters and your own hero, but we aren't going to be going as wide as most other decks. And all the fighters in the deck, including Gelephant, will be able to survive the 6 damage being dealt by our own Gelephant. The next fighter in the deck is Dubstode. This is basically Gelephant's number 5 and 6. Is a 7-mana fighter which comes in with 10 health and 2 armor. It gains +1 attack for each other Dancer in play, which probably won't matter unless we have the second copy of Dubstode, but the important part about Dubstode is that it has a Borg attack, which binds and deals 3 damage to each of your opponent's fighters. You can't use that attack twice in a row, but it will gain charge from an Extra Life, which means we can use that attack right away. And for the turns where we can't use that attack, we can just attack for 6. Next up, we have 2 copies of Lilith. She's a 10-mana fighter that comes with 18 health, and when she is played, you bind 2 of your enemy's fighters. She also has an 11 damage attack, which causes your opponent to discard 2 cards from their hand for each bound fighter they control. Because Lilith is a 3rd level fighter, it won't have charge from Extra Life, but it will bind 2 enemy fighters right away when she comes into play. And if we have her in play with a Dubstode, we can very often make our opponent discard their entire hand, thanks to the Dubstode binding so many of our opponent's fighters. The last fighter in the deck is Fish Out of Water. We're playing 2 copies of it. It is a 4-mana fighter with 7 health, and it is immune to binding. It has a 6 damage attack, which is a lot for a 4-mana fighter, but most importantly, with its Pretender attack, it removes the weakness from one of your fighters, and it makes it immune to binding. Because binding effects can be very effective at slowing down our attack and slowing down our beatdown plan with our big Gelephants and Dubstodes, it is very important to have at least 2 copies of Fish Out of Water in the deck to make sure we can make our fighters immune to binding. Now onto the spells in the deck. We're playing 4 copies of the signature card Extra Life, And to help fill up our void, we're also playing 4 copies of Alternate Timeline. It's a 1 mana spell that lets you look at the top 2 cards of your deck, you draw one, and you void the other. Alternate Timeline is great in this deck because there are going to be times where we will want specific cards in our hand and other cards in our void. So being able to choose from the top 2 cards for only 1 mana is very powerful. Next up, we are playing 4 copies of Crowd Surf. This is a 2 mana spell which lets you void 2 cards from the top of your deck, and then you draw one. This is a new addition to the deck from Harmonic Surge, and it is amazing at not only filling up our void, but also letting us potentially draw into more copies of Extra Life. Next up, we have 4 copies of Massive Effect. It's a 3 mana spell that lets you draw 3 cards, then discard 2. Massive Effect is going to be our main discard outlet in case we have copies of Gelephants in hand which we can't cast, but we can play with Extra Life. In order to play Extra Life more than 4 times, we are also playing 4 copies of Voidcast. This is a 5 mana spell which lets you select any spell in your void and use it immediately at no additional cost. So most of the time we are going to be using Voidcast to play Extra Life. However, because we are playing a lot of other spells, we will have a lot of other options with Voidcast too. In case we don't actually have an Extra Life in play, we can just Voidcast back a Massive Effect if need be to try and find an Extra Life. Next up, we're playing 3 copies of Unyeet. This is our other discard outlet besides Massive Effect. It's a 1 mana spell which lets you discard 2 cards from your hand, then you search your void for any card and put it back into your hand. This is a net loss of 2 cards in hand since it costs Unyeet and the 2 other cards at the cost of returning 1, but there aren't any other great spells that let us discard a card in hand besides this and Massive Effect. There are some fighters which let you discard cards. The most notable one is Afri, but Afri requires us to have a different fighter in play. And because Afri only has 3 health, I will die right away once we play Gelephant. So it might be worth it, but for this build, I would like to just go with Unyeet instead of Afri's. Next up, we have 2 copies of Rewind Time. This is a 3 mana spell, which lets us choose one of our voided spells, surprises, or equipment, and put it back into our hand. This is a more expensive version of Unyeet, which does not require us to discard cards from our hand. Next up for the spells, we are playing 3 copies of Fast Forward. It is a 1 mana spell, which increases both players' max mana by 1. Fast Forward is best in decks with a lot of 3 mana plays, like my Shiga Turbo Draw deck where all the mana engines do cost 3 mana. So you can go turn 1 Fast Forward and turn 2 play a 3 mana card. However, I do think Fast Forward is still worth it because we do want to play Extra Life as soon as we can. The fastest way for us to play Extra Life is to actually discard it and play it with Voidcast, since Voidcast costs 1 less mana than Extra Life. However, as soon as we have enough mana to consistently play Extra Life every turn, we won't actually need the other copies of Fast Forward, which is why we're only playing 3 instead of 4. Next up, we have 3 copies of Divine Wrath. This 8 mana spell voids all fighters in play, and neither player takes prize counters from it. However, even though we won't be able to take any prize counters by killing our opponent's fighters, it is still a very necessary card in this deck. Because we don't have a ton of early game plays which affect the board, Divine Wrath is going to be very useful for helping us stop our opponent's fighters. And even if we do end up voiding some of our own fighters, we can always just bring them back with more copies of Extra Life. Lastly, for the spells, we're playing 3 copies of Chains of the Deep. This is a 2 mana spell which deals 2 damage to any fighter and binds it. Even though the 2 damage won't kill a lot of fighters, the fact that it will also bind the fighter will help us buy a lot of time in the early turns, when we won't have a lot of options to impact the board. Now moving on to the surprises. We're playing 2 copies of Dance Fatigue. This is a 2 mana surprise, which binds everything that attacked this turn. I have not played Dance Fatigue yet, so I'm not entirely sure how many copies of this you should play versus Chains of the Deep, but I'd like to try out a 3-in-2 split first. Unlike Chains of the Deep, which can only bind 1 fighter, Dance Fatigue can bind more than 1. Any turns where we can force our opponent to deal us hardly any damage is going to be worth it, because one downside to Gelephant is that its ability and its Berserker Rage attack will damage our own hero too. So any turns where we can force our opponent to deal us hardly any damage is going to be worth it. Next up, we have 2 copies of Nope. It's a 3 mana surprise which counters a spell. Because I am worried about other people playing Shiga Turbo Draw decks, this deck is going to have a lot of trouble outracing a Shiga Turbo Draw deck, and the Nopes will help us counter our opponent's Wish Upon a Frogs. It will also help us counter any extra lives that our opponent plays. Even if our opponent doesn't have a lot of ways to mill themselves or even play a lot of fighters themselves, they can just use extra life to return a Gelephant from our void once we void a bunch of Gelephants. So Nope will help us stop against that plan. And lastly, we are playing 2 copies of Reverse. This is a 3-mana surprise which negates the surprise, and the player who owned that surprise gets to draw a card. One of the main worries with this deck is if our opponent is playing a lot of copies of Nope. So Reverse is mainly here just to counter our opponent's Nopes. But because Harmonic Surge introduced a lot of very good surprises, Reverse does have more uses besides just a specific counter to Nope. For the sideboard, I have 1 copy of Witchy's Hat Drop. This is a 2-mana spell, which allows you to discard 1 card from your hand, but you get to destroy a surprise or an equipment in play. In case your opponent is playing a lot of surprises themselves, or they have a lot of annoying equipments, Witchy's Hat Drop is a great card to board in. Very similar to Witchy's Hat Drop is Lava Bite, where you're playing 1 copy of this 2-mana spell, you discard 1 card from your hand, and you destroy an equipment or an arena. Because Nullifying Void not only stops the 3 damage entering ability from Gelephant, but also negates the charge given to it from extra life, and Nullifying Void can slow down this deck a lot. So we have Lava Bite, mostly for Nullifying Void, but there might be some other annoying arenas too. Next up, we have the 4th copy of Divine Wrath. In case we are very worried about our opponent's board, we can put in the 4th copy of Divine Wrath, just to make sure we can discard it and cast it early with the Void Cast. Next up for the surprises, we're playing 2 more copies of Nope, mostly for the Shiga Turbo Draw matchup. We're playing 2 copies of Save the Day. This is a 3-mana surprise, which lets you void and negate a fighter coming into play, at the cost of 5 of your hero's health. And while that may seem like a lot, another way to slow us down is with the fighter Destructa. And Destructa, like Nullifying Void, is going to negate your Gelephant's abilities, including its entering ability and charge given to it from extra life. Lastly, we have a 3rd copy of Reverse, just in case our opponent has a lot of Nopes. There are 2 fighters in the sideboard who can help us restore health to our hero, in case you do think we're going to get really low on health from our Gelephant. The first is Evangeline. She costs 8 mana, comes in with 10 health, and she has Divinity, which means every time our hero is healed, all of our fighters get +1 health and +1 attack. And instead of attacking and dealing any damage, she can give all of our fighters Life Touch, which means every time they deal damage, your hero will heal for that much damage. And if you need her to deal damage herself, she has an 8 damage attack. The other fighter is Valkyrion. She's a 7-mana fighter that comes with 12 health, and she has Life Touch herself. And not only does she have a 9 damage attack, but she also can resurrect and return a voided fighter from our void back into play. Valkyrion won't be able to make any other attacks the next turn, but if we are worried about our opponent stopping a lot of our extra lives, we can always just bring in Valkyrion, so we won't need extra life. Now, if extra life does get restricted back down to 2 copies again, once the meta settles down in the wake of Harmonic Surge being released, I do plan on taking out 2 copies of extra life for 2 more copies of Rewind Time. Even though it is risky to play a deck centered around 2 cards in your deck, the Rewind Time is going to help us return extra life into our hand once we play it, and also return any other spell which we need in order to find extra life. And because Harmonic Surge gave us Crowd Surf, we're going to have a lot easier time than before in finding extra life if we are restricted down to 2 copies. So that is Turbo Extra Life. Let me know what you think about it down in the comments down below. Even though there is no webcam tournament this week, I am going to try to record some gameplay videos, either over webcams or on a tabletop simulator, since Harmonic Surge cards were just added to TTS not too long ago. Thanks so much for watching everyone, and I will see you in the next video.